Sometimes betrayal comes wearing the mask of friendship, and those who steal from us forget that grief can transform into something far more powerful than they ever imagined. I'm Eleanor, and I dedicate my life to preserving letters that tell stories of human resilience, particularly those written by people who refused to let thieves destroy what their loved ones had built. Last month, while organizing donations at the Boston Historical Preservation Society, I discovered a leather satchel tucked behind archived newspapers from 1837. Inside were dozens of letters that chronicle one of the most extraordinary stories of betrayal and revenge I have ever encountered. This is the true story of Victoria Thornton, a widow who watched her late husband's fortune disappear through the greed of a man she trusted completely, but who found an unexpected ally in the shadows, and together they rebuilt an empire that became stronger than anything that had existed before. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was stealing from you right under your nose? Share your experience in the comments, because Victoria's story will show you that sometimes our greatest victories come not from preventing betrayal, but from how we choose to rise after it has tried to destroy us. Boston, Massachusetts, in the bitter winter of 1837, was a city where wealthy merchants built their fortunes through maritime trade and textile manufacturing, where grand Federal-style mansions lined Beacon Hill's cobblestone streets, and where the smoke from countless chimneys created a gray haze that seemed to settle permanently over the bustling harbor where ships arrived daily carrying goods from around the world. Victoria Thornton stood at the tall windows of her Marlborough Street mansion on a February morning, watching carriages navigate the icy streets below while she struggled to understand how her life had changed so completely in the 8 months since tuberculosis had taken her beloved husband Charles, leaving her alone at 26 with responsibilities she had never been prepared to handle and a fortune that seemed to be disappearing faster than she could comprehend. Charles Thornton had been one of Boston's most successful importers, building his wealth through careful investments in shipping companies, textile mills, and real estate that stretched from the Boston harbor to the growing industrial towns of Massachusetts, creating a business empire that employed hundreds of workers and generated profits that had made the Thornton name synonymous with prosperity and reliability throughout New England's commercial circles. Victoria had married Charles when she was 19, after a courtship that had been both passionate and practical, combining genuine love with the understanding that their union would strengthen two prominent Boston families whose fortunes had been built through similar combinations of hard work, intelligent investing, and the social connections that opened doors in a society where business success often depended as much on who you knew as what you accomplished. During their 7 years of marriage, Victoria had been content to focus on managing their elegant household, participating in the charitable activities that were expected of women in her social position, and supporting Charles in the social aspects of his business career, hosting dinners for important clients and maintaining relationships with the wives of other prominent merchants who formed the unofficial network through which much of Boston's business was actually conducted. Charles had handled all financial decisions himself, occasionally discussing major investments with Victoria but never requiring her to understand the complex details of shipping schedules, inventory management, or the intricate web of credit relationships that made international trade possible in an era when communications moved no faster than the ships that carried them across the Atlantic. Victoria's introduction to the reality of her husband's business empire had come through Alexander Morrison, the Scottish accountant who had managed Charles's financial affairs for over a decade and who Charles had specifically asked to guide Victoria through the complexities of inheriting and managing a business she had never needed to understand while her husband was alive. Morrison was a man in his mid-40s with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes, whose understated elegance and quiet confidence had made him indispensable to Charles and trusted by the other merchants who formed Boston's commercial elite. He possessed the rare combination of mathematical precision and personal discretion that made him valuable to men whose fortunes depended on both accurate accounting and absolute confidentiality about business dealings that often involved sensitive negotiations and competitive information that could be devastating if revealed to rivals. From their first meeting in Charles's oak-paneled study just days after the funeral, Morrison had presented himself as Victoria's protector and guide, promising to honor Charles's memory by ensuring that his widow would never have to worry about financial matters or business decisions that were, in his opinion, far too complex and demanding for a woman to handle alone. "Mrs. Thornton," he had said with apparent sincerity, settling into the chair that had been Charles's favorite while Victoria sat across from him feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility that had suddenly fallen upon her shoulders. "Your husband was not just my employer but one of my dearest friends, and I gave him my word that if anything ever happened to him, I would personally ensure that you would be protected from the harsh realities of commercial life and provided with everything you need to maintain the comfortable lifestyle he wanted you to enjoy for the rest of your life." Morrison's approach to managing Victoria's inheritance had seemed both thoughtful and appropriate during the first months after Charles's death, when grief made it difficult for her to focus on practical matters and when the complexity of her husband's business dealings felt overwhelming to someone who had never been required to understand more than the general outlines of how the family's wealth was generated and maintained. Morrison handled all communications with ship captains, warehouse managers, and the various business partners whose cooperation was essential for maintaining the flow of goods and profits that sustained the Thornton enterprises, presenting Victoria with simple summaries that emphasized the positive aspects of the business while glossing over details that he claimed would only confuse and worry her unnecessarily. But as the months passed and Victoria began to emerge from the most intense period of her grief, she started to notice troubling inconsistencies in Morrison's reports that did not match with her own observations of changes in her household expenses and lifestyle. The domestic staff that had once numbered 12 had been quietly reduced to 8, with Morrison explaining that such economies were necessary due to temporary downturns in shipping profits that would surely improve with better weather and more favorable market conditions. Maintenance projects on the mansion that Charles had planned before his death were postponed indefinitely, again with explanations about the wisdom of conservative spending during uncertain times. Most troubling of all, Victoria found herself being advised to reduce her charitable contributions and social entertaining, suggestions that Morrison presented as temporary measures but which seemed to contradict the fundamental stability that Charles had always claimed characterized their financial position. Victoria's growing concerns about her financial situation led her to begin asking more detailed questions about the specific investments and business operations that generated her income, requests that Morrison handled with a combination of patience and condescension that made her feel foolish for questioning his management while simultaneously failing to provide the clear information she was seeking. "Mrs. Thornton," he would say with the kind of gentle smile one might use with a confused child, "these matters are far more complicated than they might appear, involving shipping schedules, currency fluctuations, and market conditions that require years of experience to understand properly. Your husband trusted me to handle these complexities so that you would never have to worry about such unpleasant details, and I believe the best way to honor his memory is to continue protecting you from the burdens he never intended for you to carry." During the autumn of 1837, Victoria's unease about her financial situation intensified when she began receiving notices from creditors claiming that payments for goods and services were overdue, communications that Morrison dismissed as clerical errors or the result of temporary cash flow issues that were common in businesses dependent on seasonal shipping patterns. But when Victoria's personal banker, Thomas Whitfield, requested a private meeting to discuss concerns about withdrawals from accounts that Charles had established for household expenses, she realized that her situation might be far more serious than Morrison had led her to believe. Whitfield, a dignified man in his 60s who had handled Charles's personal banking for decades, spoke with obvious discomfort about patterns of financial activity that seemed inconsistent with the conservative management style he had observed during Charles's lifetime. "Mrs. Thornton," Whitfield said as they sat in his private office overlooking State Street, his expression grave as he reviewed ledger pages that documented transactions Victoria had never authorized or even known about, "I feel obligated to share certain observations that concern me deeply, even though doing so may seem presumptuous given that Mr. Morrison assures me he is acting under your explicit instructions. The pattern of withdrawals from your husband's accounts has accelerated significantly since his death, with large sums being transferred to investments that seem much more speculative and risky than anything Charles would have considered appropriate for securing his family's long-term stability." Whitfield's revelations about unauthorized financial activities conducted in Victoria's name created the first concrete evidence that Morrison's management of her inheritance involved deception on a scale she had never imagined possible from someone Charles had trusted so completely. When she confronted Morrison about these transactions, his explanations became increasingly vague and defensive, featuring complex discussions of market opportunities and investment strategies that seemed designed more to confuse than to clarify the actual disposition of her assets. Morrison's growing irritation with her questions marked a significant change from the deferential patience he had shown during the early months of his management, suggesting that he had expected her to remain passive and trusting indefinitely. It was during this period of growing suspicion and confusion that Victoria began receiving anonymous letters that would ultimately reveal the full extent of Morrison's betrayal and provide her with the evidence she needed to fight back against the systematic theft of her inheritance. The first letter arrived on a November evening when rain drummed against the windows of her study and the gas lamps cast dancing shadows on the Persian carpets that Charles had imported from his business trips to the Middle East. The letter was written in careful, educated handwriting on plain paper that revealed nothing about its author, but the information it contained was so specific and alarming that Victoria could not dismiss it as the work of someone seeking to cause trouble without basis in fact. "Dear Mrs. Thornton," the anonymous letter began, "I write to you at great personal risk because I cannot remain silent while witnessing the systematic destruction of your late husband's legacy by someone he trusted as a friend and advisor. Mr. Morrison has been transferring funds from your business accounts to investments that benefit him personally rather than preserving your inheritance. The shipping contracts he claims are providing steady income have actually been cancelled or transferred to companies he controls privately. The warehouse inventory he reports as maintaining its value has been sold to buyers who pay him directly, with the proceeds never entering your accounts. I have documentation to support these claims, but I cannot reveal my identity without endangering my own position. Please investigate these matters before it is too late to recover what has been stolen from you." The anonymous letter included specific details about transactions, account numbers, and business relationships that could only have been known by someone with access to Morrison's private records, making it impossible for Victoria to dismiss the accusations as malicious gossip or the fantasies of someone seeking to cause problems without foundation. When Victoria discreetly investigated some of the specific claims made in the letter, she discovered that several business relationships Morrison had claimed were generating steady profits had actually been terminated months earlier, with the income from final shipments apparently disappearing into accounts she had no knowledge of or access to. The anonymous correspondent had provided her with the names of ship captains and warehouse managers who, when approached carefully, confirmed that their business dealings with Thornton Enterprises had been concluded and settled in ways that suggested Morrison had collected payments that should have gone directly to Victoria. Over the following weeks, additional anonymous letters arrived with increasing frequency, each providing more detailed evidence of Morrison's betrayal and clearer instructions about how Victoria could verify the accusations independently without alerting him to her growing awareness of his theft. The anonymous correspondent demonstrated intimate knowledge of both Morrison's methods and the broader Boston business community, suggesting that he was someone who moved within commercial circles but occupied a position that allowed him to observe activities without attracting attention to his own interests or motivations. The letters also revealed a personality that combined moral outrage about injustice with practical understanding of how to gather evidence and build a case that could ultimately expose corruption that had been carefully hidden behind the facade of legitimate business management. Mrs. Thornton read a letter that arrived in early December. Morrison's theft of your inheritance follows a pattern he has used before with other clients who trusted him during periods of vulnerability. He creates false documentation to justify transfers of assets to investments that exist primarily on paper, while the actual funds flow to accounts he controls through intermediaries who help him convert your property into wealth he can claim as his own. The shipping business he reports as declining due to market conditions is actually more profitable than ever, but contracts have been redirected to benefit his personal ventures rather than maintaining income for your household. I urge you to demand a complete accounting of all transactions since your husband's death, but do so through independent accountants who have no relationship with Morrison and cannot be influenced by his explanations or threats. The anonymous letters provided Victoria not only with evidence of Morrison's betrayal but also with detailed guidance about how to protect herself while gathering the additional proof she would need to expose his crimes and recover what had been stolen from her. The correspondent advised her to secure copies of all financial documents in her possession, to establish new banking relationships that Morrison could not monitor or influence, and to begin consulting with lawyers who specialized in cases involving fiduciary fraud and could help her understand both her legal options and the practical challenges of proving theft by someone who had been granted legitimate authority to manage her affairs. As winter deepened and the anonymous letters continued to arrive with precise information about Morrison's fraudulent activities, Victoria began to suspect that her mysterious correspondent was not simply a concerned observer but someone who had access to information that could only come from working closely with Morrison or having some form of direct involvement in the business operations he was manipulating for his personal benefit. The detailed knowledge of accounting procedures, the familiarity with specific business relationships, and the understanding of Morrison's personality and methods all suggested that the letters were coming from someone who observed his activities on a daily basis but who had chosen to help Victoria rather than participate in or ignore the systematic theft of her inheritance. Victoria's investigation into Morrison's management of her finances, guided by information from the anonymous letters, revealed a pattern of fraud so extensive and systematic that it became clear he had been planning to steal her inheritance from the moment Charles died, possibly even before. Morrison had used his position as her financial advisor to redirect income from legitimate business operations into accounts he controlled, to sell assets at below-market prices to buyers who then resold them to his associates at significant profits, and to create false documentation showing declining business performance that justified reducing Victoria's household expenses while the money saved flowed into investments that benefited him personally. The scope of Morrison's betrayal was both financial and personal, as he had exploited not only Victoria's trust and inexperience with business matters but also her grief and isolation after Charles's death, using her emotional vulnerability to discourage questions and maintain control over information that could have exposed his crimes much earlier. Morrison had calculated that a grieving widow would be easy to manipulate and unlikely to investigate discrepancies in his management, especially if he maintained the pretense of protecting her from the complexities of business dealings while actually stealing everything she had inherited from her husband's years of honest work and careful planning. By the beginning of 1838, Victoria possessed enough evidence of Morrison's fraud to confront him directly, but the anonymous letters had also warned her that direct confrontation without careful preparation could give him opportunities to destroy evidence, transfer remaining assets beyond her reach, or even flee Boston with wealth he had already stolen from her inheritance. The anonymous correspondent advised patience and strategic planning, suggesting that the most effective approach would be to gather irrefutable proof of his crimes while simultaneously securing legal representation and financial resources that would allow her to fight back effectively when the time came for open confrontation. The turning point in Victoria's battle against Morrison's theft came when her anonymous correspondent took the unprecedented step of revealing not only more detailed evidence of the fraud but also his own identity, transforming their relationship from mysterious correspondence to direct partnership in seeking justice for the crimes that had been committed against her inheritance. The revelation came in a letter that arrived on a snowy January morning, written in the same careful handwriting that had guided her through months of discovery, but this time signed with a name and an explanation that changed everything she thought she knew about who had been helping her and why. You know that feeling when someone reaches out to help you in your darkest hour, even when they have everything to lose by doing so? Victoria's anonymous guardian angel had been watching Morrison steal her future piece by piece, but his conscience wouldn't let him stay silent anymore. Sometimes the people who save us are the ones we least expect, hiding in plain sight while they gather the courage to do what's right. If you've ever had someone unexpected stand up for you when you couldn't stand up for yourself, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. These stories of strangers becoming heroes remind us that there's still goodness in this world, and your support helps me continue sharing these tales of courage that inspire us all to be better people. Dear Mrs. Thornton, the letter began, I can no longer remain anonymous while helping you fight for justice, because the time has come for me to step forward and provide testimony that can definitively prove Morrison's guilt and help you recover what he has stolen from your family's legacy. My name is Edward Sullivan, and I work as a senior clerk in Morrison's accounting office, where I have witnessed firsthand the systematic theft of your inheritance and maintained secret records that document every fraudulent transaction he has conducted since your husband's death. I am writing to you now not just as someone who has observed injustice, but as someone who understands that remaining silent makes me complicit in crimes that violate everything I believe about honor, honesty, and the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. Edward Sullivan's revelation of his identity transformed Victoria's understanding of both her situation and the man who had been helping her navigate the complex challenge of exposing Morrison's fraud while protecting herself from further victimization. Edward was a man of 35 who had lost his left leg in a childhood accident involving a runaway carriage, an injury that had prevented him from pursuing the active business career he had once envisioned but had led him to develop exceptional skills in accounting and record-keeping that made him valuable to merchants who needed precise financial management and absolute discretion about their business dealings. His physical disability had also created a social invisibility that allowed him to observe activities and conversations that people often forgot were being witnessed by someone they considered insignificant. Edward had worked for Morrison for 7 years, initially admiring his employer's apparent integrity and professional competence, but gradually becoming aware that Morrison's success was built on practices that ranged from ethically questionable to outright criminal, involving the systematic exploitation of clients who trusted him to protect their interests rather than advance his own. Edward's decision to help Victoria had not been made lightly or quickly, but had evolved over months of watching Morrison steal from a woman who was already suffering from the loss of her husband and who deserved protection rather than predation from someone who had been entrusted with preserving her financial security. Edward's letter explained that his decision to reveal his identity had been motivated not only by moral outrage about Morrison's crimes but also by growing concern that Morrison was beginning to suspect that someone in his office was providing information to Victoria, creating danger that required more direct action to protect both of them and ensure that justice could be achieved before Morrison could destroy evidence or flee with assets he had already stolen. Edward also acknowledged that his admiration for Victoria's courage and determination in fighting back against Morrison's fraud had evolved into deeper feelings that made him even more committed to helping her achieve both financial recovery and personal vindication. Mrs. Thornton, Edward's letter continued, I must confess that my motivations for helping you have become more personal than I initially intended, as I have come to admire not only your courage in fighting against injustice but also your dignity in bearing losses that would have destroyed someone with less inner strength. I know that my circumstances make me an unlikely ally for someone of your social position, but I hope that my usefulness in exposing Morrison's crimes and my genuine desire to see justice done will compensate for any awkwardness that might result from a working man offering assistance to a lady who moves in circles far above my own station. Edward's offer to reveal his identity and provide direct testimony about Morrison's fraudulent activities created both opportunities and risks that Victoria had to consider carefully before deciding how to proceed with her campaign to recover her inheritance and expose the man who had betrayed her trust so completely. Edward's position in Morrison's office gave him access to original documents and first-hand knowledge of fraudulent transactions that would be invaluable in building a legal case, but his decision to help her would certainly cost him his employment and could potentially expose him to criminal charges if Morrison claimed that Edward had been complicit in activities he was now trying to expose. Victoria's response to Edward's revelation was both practical and emotional, recognizing that his willingness to sacrifice his own security to help her represented the kind of moral courage that had become rare in her experience with people who claimed to have her best interests at heart. When she finally met Edward in person at a small coffee house near the harbor where they could speak privately without attracting attention from Morrison or his associates, she discovered a man whose quiet intelligence and genuine integrity impressed her far more than the superficial charm and false sincerity that had initially made Morrison seem trustworthy. Edward's appearance reflected both his working-class origins and the self-respect that had allowed him to maintain his dignity despite the physical challenges that limited his opportunities and the social barriers that prevented people like him from achieving recognition for their abilities and contributions. He walked with the aid of a wooden leg that was skillfully crafted but obviously functional rather than decorative, wore clothing that was clean and well-maintained but clearly not expensive, and spoke with the careful precision of someone who had educated himself through reading rather than formal schooling but who possessed intelligence and knowledge that surpassed many people with more privileged backgrounds. Victoria found herself impressed not only by Edward's moral courage in risking his own security to help her but also by his practical wisdom about how to approach the complex challenge of exposing Morrison's fraud while protecting both of them from retaliation and ensuring that recovered assets would actually be returned to her control rather than disappearing into the legal system that favored men like Morrison who understood how to manipulate procedures and relationships to their advantage. "Mrs. Thornton," Edward said as they sat in the corner of the coffee house where the noise of other conversations provided privacy for their sensitive discussion, "Morrison's theft of your inheritance has been systematic and extensive, but he has also been careless about destroying evidence because he assumed you would never investigate his activities or question his management of your affairs. I have copies of documents that prove he has redirected over $60,000 from your accounts to investments that benefit him personally, sold warehouse inventory worth another $30,000 to buyers who immediately resold the goods to his associates at substantial profits, and canceled shipping contracts worth thousands in annual income that he then renegotiated for his own benefit." The evidence Edward had collected during his months of secret documentation included not only financial records that proved Morrison's theft but also correspondence that revealed his contemptuous attitude toward Victoria and his confidence that she would never possess either the intelligence or the determination needed to challenge his authority or investigate his management of her inheritance. Morrison's letters to business associates contained dismissive references to Victoria as a grieving widow who trusts me to handle everything and explicit discussions of strategies for maximizing his personal profits from managing her affairs while maintaining the pretense of protecting her interests. Edward's documentation of Morrison's crimes provided Victoria with the evidence she needed to pursue legal action, but he also helped her understand that achieving justice would require more than simply proving Morrison's guilt. Because the legal system of the 1830s was designed to favor men like Morrison who possessed both financial resources and social connections that could influence judges and juries who might be reluctant to believe that a respectable businessman could systematically steal from a client he had been trusted to protect. Edward's strategic thinking about how to expose Morrison's fraud reflected both his practical understanding of how business and legal systems actually functioned and his determination to ensure that Victoria would not only recover her stolen inheritance but also be positioned to rebuild and expand her late husband's business empire in ways that would honor Charles's memory while proving that a woman could successfully manage complex commercial enterprises if given accurate information and honest advice. The partnership that developed between Victoria and Edward during the winter of 1838 combined her social connections and financial resources with his detailed knowledge of Morrison's methods and his practical understanding of accounting and business management, creating a formidable alliance that Morrison had never anticipated when he had dismissed Victoria as an easy victim who would never question his authority or investigate his activities. Working together, Victoria and Edward developed a comprehensive strategy for exposing Morrison's fraud that involved not only gathering additional evidence and building legal cases but also protecting Victoria's remaining assets from further theft and preparing her to assume direct control of business operations that Morrison had been managing for his own benefit rather than hers. Edward's insights into the actual profitability and potential of Charles's original business ventures revealed that Morrison's claims about declining markets and reduced income had been completely false, designed to justify reducing Victoria's lifestyle while the money she was saving flowed into investments that benefited him personally. Edward also helped Victoria understand that recovering her stolen inheritance would require not just legal action but also practical steps to rebuild business relationships that Morrison had damaged or terminated, to re-establish credit and reputation with suppliers and customers who had been told that Thornton Enterprises were experiencing financial difficulties, and to demonstrate that the business empire Charles had built could continue to thrive under new management that prioritized honest dealing and long-term stability over short-term profits extracted through fraud. The relationship between Victoria and Edward evolved naturally from professional partnership to personal affection as they worked together to expose Morrison's crimes and prepare for the challenge of rebuilding what he had attempted to destroy. Edward's combination of moral integrity, practical intelligence, and genuine concern for Victoria's welfare created feelings of respect and attraction that grew stronger as she observed his willingness to sacrifice his own security to help her achieve justice. Victoria discovered that Edward's quiet strength and honest character provided emotional support that was far more valuable than the superficial sympathy she had received from other people who claimed to care about her welfare but who had offered no practical assistance in dealing with the crisis Morrison had created. By the spring of 1838, Victoria and Edward had assembled enough evidence to confront Morrison directly and demand not only the return of stolen assets but also complete cooperation in transferring control of business operations back to Victoria's management, supported by legal documents that would make further fraud impossible and criminal charges that would ensure Morrison faced consequences for the systematic theft he had committed while pretending to protect her interests. Their partnership had also evolved into a relationship that transcended social barriers and conventional expectations, proving that genuine affection and mutual respect could create bonds stronger than artificial distinctions based on wealth, social position, or physical circumstances that had no bearing on character or moral worth. Morrison's response to being confronted with irrefutable evidence of his fraud revealed both his arrogance and his fundamental misunderstanding of the woman he had been systematically robbing for over a year. When Victoria and Edward presented him with detailed documentation of his theft and demanded immediate restitution along with complete cooperation in transferring business operations back to Victoria's control, Morrison initially attempted to deny the accusations and then tried to intimidate them by claiming that no one would believe the word of a crippled clerk and a hysterical widow against a respected businessman with years of sterling reputation in Boston's commercial community. Morrison's threats and attempted intimidation backfired completely, serving only to confirm Victoria's determination to pursue justice regardless of the social and legal obstacles she might face, while also providing additional evidence of his character that would be useful in court proceedings and in convincing other members of Boston's business community that his reputation had been built on deception rather than genuine competence and integrity. Morrison's assumption that Victoria would be easily intimidated or that Edward could be dismissed because of his social position and physical disability demonstrated the same arrogance and contempt for others that had enabled him to steal from Victoria in the first place. The legal battle that followed Morrison's refusal to cooperate voluntarily became one of the most closely watched court cases in Boston during 1838. Involving not only the specific crimes Morrison had committed against Victoria but also broader questions about the rights of women to control inherited property and the responsibilities of men who accepted positions of trust in managing other people's financial affairs. Victoria's willingness to fight publicly for justice, supported by Edward's detailed testimony about Morrison's methods and motivated by their determination to prevent him from victimizing anyone else in similar circumstances, transformed what could have been a private settlement into a public examination of fraud and accountability that had implications far beyond the recovery of one woman's stolen inheritance. The trial revealed the full extent of Morrison's systematic theft and deception, including evidence that Victoria had been only one of several clients whose trust he had exploited for personal gain, creating a pattern of behavior that demonstrated deliberate criminality rather than simple mistakes in judgment or temporary lapses in ethical standards. Edward's testimony provided detailed documentation of fraudulent transactions and revealed Morrison's contemptuous attitude toward the people he claimed to serve, while Victoria's own testimony demonstrated intelligence and determination that contradicted Morrison's claims about her inability to understand or manage business affairs competently. The verdict in favor of Victoria and the substantial damages awarded for both financial losses and emotional distress not only provided her with the resources needed to rebuild her inheritance but also established legal precedents that would make it more difficult for other unscrupulous men to exploit vulnerable clients in similar circumstances. Morrison's conviction and imprisonment served as a warning to others who might consider using positions of trust to steal from people who depended on them for honest advice and competent management of their affairs. More importantly for Victoria personally, her successful battle against Morrison's fraud provided her with knowledge, confidence, and business skills that enabled her to take direct control of rebuilding Charles's business empire rather than depending on other people to manage her financial affairs on her behalf. Working closely with Edward, who became not only her business partner but also her husband in a wedding ceremony that took place quietly but joyfully in the spring of 1839, Victoria rebuilt and expanded the business operations that Morrison had nearly destroyed, proving that competent management based on honesty and hard work could create prosperity that was both sustainable and ethically justified. The partnership between Victoria and Edward, both in business and in marriage, created a success story that became legendary in Boston's commercial circles, demonstrating that love based on mutual respect and shared values could overcome social barriers and conventional expectations while building prosperity that honored the memory of those who had been lost while creating new opportunities for those who remained. As we've walked through Victoria's incredible journey from victim to victor, I'm struck by how her story shows us that sometimes our greatest losses prepare us for our most meaningful victories. The partnership she built with Edward wasn't just about recovering money, it was about discovering that true strength comes from people who choose to stand together against injustice, regardless of what society expects from them. Have you ever found that your biggest challenges led you to the relationships and opportunities that changed your life for the better? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. And if you have ideas for other historical tales you'd like me to uncover, please share them too. Your engagement helps me continue preserving these powerful reminders that courage and love can triumph over any betrayal. Victoria and Edward's success in rebuilding the Thornton business empire exceeded even their most optimistic expectations, as their combination of Victoria's social connections and inherited resources with Edward's practical expertise and ethical approach to business management created opportunities that neither could have achieved alone. By 1840, their shipping operations were generating more income than Charles's original business had ever produced. Their investments in textile manufacturing were providing steady profits that supported both business expansion and charitable activities, and their reputation for honest dealing had made them preferred partners for merchants throughout New England who valued reliability over the quick profits that attracted less scrupulous competitors. Their personal relationship had also flourished in ways that defied the social conventions and expectations that had initially made their partnership seem impossible to people who judged relationships based on surface appearances rather than genuine compatibility and shared values. Edward's intelligence, integrity, and business acumen had earned him respect among Boston's commercial elite that transcended the social barriers his working-class origins and physical disability might have created in other circumstances. Victoria's willingness to challenge conventional expectations about women's capabilities in business had opened doors for other women who possessed similar talents but had lacked the opportunity or confidence to pursue careers in fields dominated by men who often assumed that commercial success required qualities that women supposedly did not possess. The charitable foundation they established in Charles's memory became a model for organized philanthropy that provided assistance to widows, orphans, and disabled workers who might otherwise have been left without resources or opportunities to rebuild their lives after experiencing losses similar to those Victoria had faced after Charles's death. Their foundation's work helped dozens of families recover from financial disasters caused by fraud, abandonment, or business failures, providing both immediate assistance and long-term support that enabled people to rebuild their lives with dignity rather than depending permanently on charity for survival. Victoria's transformation from grieving widow to successful businesswoman and social reformer had been made possible not only by Edward's assistance and moral support but also by her own determination to honor Charles's memory by building something even better than what had been lost, rather than simply recovering what had been stolen and accepting that justice was the best outcome she could realistically expect from her battle against Morrison's betrayal. Their story became an inspiration for other people facing similar challenges, demonstrating that betrayal and loss could become the foundation for achievements that were more meaningful than anything that might have been possible if tragedy had never forced them to discover strengths and capabilities they had never known they possessed. The business empire Victoria and Edward built together was stronger and more ethical than what Morrison had tried to steal. Their marriage was happier than relationships based purely on social expectations and financial considerations, and their impact on Boston's community was more positive than anything they could have achieved individually. As Victoria stood once again at the windows of her Marlborough Street mansion on a spring morning in 1841, watching carriages navigate streets that no longer seemed threatening or unfamiliar, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since that terrible winter when Morrison's theft had seemed to destroy everything Charles had worked to build for their future together. The view from her windows now included warehouses, ships, and commercial buildings that bore the Thornton name and represented honest prosperity built through ethical business practices rather than fraud and deception. The future that had once seemed impossible was now reality, created through the partnership of two people who had found in each other not only love but also the courage to rebuild what betrayal had tried to destroy. The letters Edward had sent her as an anonymous correspondent had saved not only her inheritance but also her faith in human goodness, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, there were people willing to risk their own security to help others achieve justice. Their correspondence had evolved into a partnership that proved love could transcend social barriers and conventional expectations when it was based on genuine respect, shared values, and mutual determination to build something beautiful from the wreckage that others had created. Victoria's story had become proof that revenge could take the form of success rather than destruction, that justice could be achieved through building rather than tearing down, and that the strongest foundations for future happiness were often constructed from the materials that remained after betrayal had done its worst damage. Morrison's attempt to steal her inheritance had ultimately led her to discover capabilities she had never known she possessed, relationships that were more meaningful than any she had previously experienced, and purposes that gave her life more satisfaction than the comfortable but passive existence she had lived before tragedy forced her to become someone stronger than she had ever imagined possible. The business empire Victoria and Edward built together continued to prosper for decades, becoming one of New England's most successful and respected commercial enterprises while maintaining the ethical standards and concern for employee welfare that had distinguished their approach to business from the beginning. Their marriage produced children who inherited not only financial security but also values that emphasized hard work, honest dealing, and concern for others who faced challenges similar to those their parents had overcome through courage, intelligence, and mutual support. Victoria Thornton Sullivan's transformation from victim of betrayal to successful entrepreneur and social reformer became a legend that inspired generations of people who faced their own challenges with fraud, loss, and social barriers that seemed insurmountable until they discovered that determination and ethical principles could overcome obstacles that appeared impossible to people who lacked the courage to fight for justice and the wisdom to recognize that true success was measured not only by financial achievement but by the positive impact their lives had on others who needed encouragement, assistance, and examples of what was possible when people refused to accept defeat as permanent. Victoria's journey from despair to triumph proves that sometimes the people who try to destroy us actually lead us to discover strength we never knew we had and relationships we never would have found otherwise. Her partnership with Edward shows us that real love grows from respect and shared values rather than social expectations, and that the most beautiful victories are those that help others while honoring the memory of those we've lost. What challenges in your own life have led you to discover capabilities or relationships you never would have found in easier circumstances? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these stories of resilience remind us that our setbacks often become the setups for our greatest comebacks. If Victoria's story has inspired you to believe that justice and love can triumph over any betrayal, please subscribe to hear more tales of remarkable people who refuse to let others define their destinies. Your support helps me continue preserving these powerful reminders that courage, integrity, and partnership can rebuild anything that fraud and betrayal try to destroy. I'm Eleanor, and I rescue stories that show us how the human spirit transforms tragedy into triumph, betrayal into wisdom, and loss into the foundation for love that proves stronger than any force that tries to defeat it. Victoria and Edward's story reminds us that sometimes our greatest enemies lead us directly to our greatest blessings, and that revenge is sweetest when it takes the form of building something beautiful from what others tried to destroy.